Well, thank you, Rigel. And thanks to everybody. Good group here tonight showing up live. I really appreciate it. And part of what makes this live discussion good is that at the end we'll have a conversation, discussion. And I hope that, there's some of you here are experts on the subject of developmental psychology. You might teach it as part of your coaching practice or your consulting practice. And, many of you I know have been studying it for years. Others I know may not be quite as up to speed on all the details of developmental psychology, which is the subject of my talk tonight. And so, I'm going to say a few things, but this is not going to be a substitute for a general introduction to developmental psychology. But hopefully folks who are new to this can follow along. And at the end, not only do I invite, challenges and objections, regular questions, but also basic questions, right? So if there's something that is that I didn't make clear about the basics of developmental psychology, please don't be embarrassed to ask about it, because we're not assuming that folks know all the details. So just a quick update on my work. I've been as you know, working on this book that I finished probably in July. We've got an excellent publisher, Orbis Books. That's a distinguished academic publisher of philosophy and theology, and they're sort of the leading publisher of books on Teilhard de Chardin, but they have a broad catalog. They've been around for 50 years. But I'm going to make an announcement about the book, and I'll have plenty of chance to introduce that and give my standard book talk on it. So I'm excited to share that with you, but it's not going to be published until next year. So there's just the pipeline in the publishing industry is rather long. As some of you who are authors know, it takes forever. And in the meantime, I'm working on co-convening a spiritual philosophy conference with the Center for Process Studies and the Center for Christogenesis at Villanova University. It's not going to be at Villanova, but that's another thing that's in the works that I'm working on now. We've got a lot of good progress on it, but again, we'll do a press release and I'll make an official announcement and provide details about that. But in the meantime, while I'm waiting for the book and working on the conference, one of the things that I thought would be useful for this group would be to deliver maybe 2 or 3 critiques of standard integral philosophy. And the critiques are meant to be constructive. They're deeply appreciative of the wisdom of integral philosophy. And like all philosophy, all social science, it's something that's evolving. It benefits from critique. It can always be improved. Certainly our understanding of how consciousness evolves is a crucial line of inquiry in our time. It's urgently needed because of this, conflict that America is in and much of the developed world. And we need to grow out of this and understanding how consciousness evolves, how it co-evolves with culture and artifacts is some of the most useful things that humans can come to know. So looking into what we know, what we've discovered, what's wrong with those theories, how they are partial and can be expanded, at least in my experience, is the focus of a couple of critical talks. This is the first one. I'll give another one next year and maybe a third before the book comes out. But this time I'm focusing on developmental psychology because, so the focus of my work in general and the Institute for Cultural Evolution for the past couple of years and going forward strategically is working on developing the influence and the visibility of developmental philosophy. And as I discussed in a previous talk, developmental philosophy consists of, many strains, but the 2 primary sources of philosophy that combine into this kind of umbrella category are process philosophy, stemming from Whitehead and many of his able proponents and people who are in his lineage. And then also integral philosophy, which I define broadly, certainly to include the important work of Ken Wilber, but also Teilhard de Chardin, I think, is very much an integral philosopher. Henri Bergson, there's a whole line of integral philosophy, and that's something else that I've discussed elsewhere. But the thing that developmental philosophy gains from integral philosophy, among a variety of things, but perhaps the most central is an understanding of stages of development, right? Stages specifically of consciousness and culture. And these stages, they violate the idea of growth in stages, although it's a basic, a basic behavior of systems at every level as they grow. There is understandably, which I'll cover in this talk, people who object to the idea and who have tried to invalidate it, and it's definitely not a popular framing within academia and much of the social sciences. But I think there are extremely good reasons to recognize stages as long as we keep improving our conception of them and how we understand them. And one of the things that, from a philosophical perspective, is most powerful about integral philosophies bringing to process philosophy and developmental philosophy. One of the things that it really brings is the stages reflect the larger structure of emergence since the Big Bang, right? The periodic table of elements can be seen as a series of stages, right? The phylogenetic tree of life can be seen as a series of stages, and the evolution of the noosphere, that is consciousness, culture, and artifacts, art, technology, the physical stuff. But this sort of threefold evolution, which I'll elaborate on in another occasion. This is it too evolves by stages. Indeed, it's an extension of the structure of emergence into human history. So it's very important in order that we're going to characterize it as an authentic kind of evolution. Not that we're going to conflate it, right, with biological evolution or cosmological evolution, but what makes it part of this larger unfolding of the universe since the Big Bang is this increasing structure of emergence, of transcendence and inclusion, whereby something more keeps coming from something less. So developmental psychology is from the beginning been centrally focused on the stages of human development. And I'll say a little bit about the history of it, but I just want to share my screen for a minute and just say what I'm going to be covering tonight. So first, I will talk about developmental psychology, its history briefly. Then I will mention what I see as its blind spots and theoretical shortcomings. Again, how it can be improved while still validating, I think, most of its core insights and wisdom. I want to talk about the normative implications of developmental stages. There have been some understandable attempts to try to relativize the stages as, whatever's most appropriate for the life conditions, but I don't think that argument really succeeds, and I'll say why. And then after talking a little bit about how normativity, or in other words, better, is unavoidable, I will then present some arguments for why I think cultural growth especially can be properly understood through a series of stages, although there's more to it than that. But the stages, it's important not to ignore them for politically correct reasons. And then finally, I'm going to talk about how developmental psychology has been integrated into philosophy, right? Starting way back in the early part of the 20th century with an early integral philosopher, Peter and Sorokin, right? And then we have Gebser and Habermas and Wilber. So I'm going to keep coming back to similar themes, but hopefully at higher levels. But I want to begin by first talking about conventional developmental psychology. That is, it begins really with the work of James Mark Baldwin in the 1890s. Baldwin recognized stages. He was an early psychologist, but he got canceled and was kind of forgotten by mainstream academia. But he nevertheless influenced really who many see as the father of developmental psychology, which is Jean Piaget, a Swiss researcher who began his research on children. He was basically focusing on the development of children. And through his research, he identified a universal series of stages of development that children go through. Piaget was not really well recognized or influential within academic psychology in general throughout the 20th century until the 1960s, when academic psychology kind of broke out of the straitjacket of behavioralism, right? Behavioralism, which basically said there's no interiors. We can just, anything we can say about psychology, we have to read off of what people physically do, you know? In other words, the image of running the rats in the maze to understand psychology were some of the more ridiculous tropes of behaviorism, which I think at this point is fairly discredited. So in searching for another way to understand, especially human development, Piaget became celebrated in the 60s and 70s, and his focus was on what he called the cognitive line of development, or the intelligence of children. But other developmental psychologists, most notably Lawrence Kohlberg, started doing similar experiments, inspired by Piaget, but instead of looking at cognitive development, he wanted to know about the moral development of children. He found similar stages, although not directly identical. There was a lot of affinity between the stages of Piaget and the stages of Kohlberg, this was followed by other important names within the history of developmental psychology, like Jane Loevinger. She brought a kind of a feminist perspective to development and had some important critiques of Loevinger and Piaget. And it's a rich history that, and I'm not going to recount further than that. But since the 1980s, in some ways, the mantle of father of developmental psychology, or leading developmental psychologist, has been occupied by Robert Kegan, who is he was a distinguished professor at Harvard, at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. And unlike Piaget, who Kegan credits as his mentor, right? He calls his work neo-Piagetian. Kegan focused on adults, right? He wanted to know, his premise was that once children reach the basic end state of their development into adulthood, that evolution continues, or psychological development continues. And like Piaget, he had posited, or his research pointed to universal stages. This idea of universal stages was carried forward by Kegan, whereby his research was what's called qualitative research. It involved hundreds of people, and he developed a test, subject-object test, which he used to determine where a person was, not just on a continuum, but on a definite stage-wise progression of what Kegan called orders of consciousness, right? So it kind of starts with the Piaget levels, but then as adulthood is reached, Kegan identified these kind of universal stages that people grow into, and they kind of determine how psychologically developed or grown a person is according to their stage of development. And these ideas were highly influential in the 70s and 80s and continue to be to this day, right? I want to honor Kegan. He has brought some major insights into our understanding of how consciousness evolves. And he's highly influential, right, beyond, outside of academic psychology, or education. He has helped develop this idea of deliberately developmental organizations that has been highly influential in the organizational development field. And his idea of subject and object has been taught by many people who are trying to bring forward the insights of developmental psychology and work with people to increase their stage. There's a whole host of developmental psychologists now that are directly associated with integral philosophy, are at least partially informed by it, like Bill Torbert and Michael Basichis and Suzanne Cook-Greuter and Terry O'Fallon. I could mention some others, but developmental psychology is an important cornerstone of integral philosophy. And if you go to some of the integral spaces or the integral conferences, this is one of the main kind of accepted pieces of wisdom. I should mention Clare Graves is kind of a special case, and I'm going to get to him in a minute. But certainly, of all the developmental psychologists that have influenced integral philosophy, I would say that spiral dynamics, which is a kind of a popularized version of the thinking and research of Clare W. Graves, has been extremely influential. And indeed, that's how I came to integral philosophy. In 1999, in the 90s, I was particularly intrigued. Our whole little social circle here in Boulder, we're very intrigued by the work of Paul Ray, who is a sociologist, right? Not a developmental psychologist. And he was funded by the Fetzer Institute and the Institute for Noetic Sciences. And he did a proper academic study and discovered that there were three major cultures in America, what he called traditional, modern, and the cultural creatives, right? And we thought, wow, that's finally, it's been framed who we are, right? We're the cultural creatives. And of course, the cultural creatives were romanticized and glorified and just kind of the higher level of spiritual awakening in the age of Aquarius and all that. But when spiral dynamics became popularized later in the 90s, Ray even admitted in the foreword to his book that spiral dynamics goes way further than his sociological research, and he kind of, hats off to Clare W. Graves and what he was able to understand, because unlike other developmental psychologists in the 90s, Graves died in the 80s, but his work was carried forward. And one of the things that made Graves particularly influential as a developmental psychologist was his framing of the progressive postmodern worldview, right, which spiral dynamics labels green. And the color jargon is still strong in the integral scene. People refer to it as green because it's a handy label, but because it's kind of insider jargon, I try not to use it because I want this to be accessible to people who are not, don't know the lingo. And so we're talking about progressive postmodernism as a significant stage. That's another name for the cultural creatives, or for the, the green value meme. But prior to Graves, the developmental psychologists, what was beyond modernity, or in spiral dynamics, the orange meme, right? That was ill-defined, right? So if you look, for example, in Ken Wilber's 1995 book, Sex Ecology, Spirituality, although he talks about postmodernism as a philosophy, his stage scheme follows Gebser, and it goes right from modernist to integral. There's no intervening cultural stage or stage of consciousness, progressive postmodernism. And once that became clear that Graves had pointed out something that was missing in the other forms of developmental psychology that were influential at the time, Wilber adopted it. And it was right around there in 1999 and 2000 that I came into the scene and through spiral dynamics, but was quickly interested in the philosophical integration of that into integral philosophy. So that's the basics of where we are with developmental psychology. And what I want to focus on now is the shortcomings of it, at least from my perspective. See if I can get this to go over here. Okay. So let me say first that the stages that are identified in the various lines of development that are studied by the various developmental psychologists who are working in this space, that those stages are real, and they're not all wrong to recognize those stages, right? But the critique isn't about the stages. The critique is about the source of those stages, or how they arise, or where the kind of the systemic structure of them comes from. Piaget found primarily the source of his stages in the biological development of children's brains, right? So their brains are getting more wired up as they grow, and this wiring results in specific points of inflection whereby they move to a higher level. But it was, that as consciousness and biological development were said to unfold together, which was part of the premise of empirical scientific validity that helped Piaget gain a lot of influence. But when it comes to adult development, while we can certainly, we have brain plasticity and we can certainly wire up new parts of our brains, maybe 28, right? Like my sons their brains are still developing. But and there's lots of research that says the brain continues to develop into young adulthood. But regardless, Kegan could not tie his stages to biology. So he had to come up with a new source for these stages. And he theorized that it was the pressure of life conditions, right? In other words, when the demands of one's environment become more complex than their stage of consciousness is able to deal with, that pressure of unresolved or problematic life conditions causes the psychology to jump up a level, right? To jump into a new order of consciousness. And his influential book, In Over Our Heads, right, was a series of anecdotes and case studies of people in business situations and family situations where the demands of their life conditions, that their psychology didn't suit that. And that the idea was that if you're in over your head, then you have an opportunity to evolve to a kind of another order, a higher order of consciousness, whereby you're able to make meaning in a way that can more effectively cope with and deal with and take complex demands of your society in their stride. So the idea that life conditions create the evolution of consciousness, that's not all wrong. But the problem is that in conventional developmental psychology, there's no solid recognition of cultural evolution, right? In other words, theoretically speaking, it's all personal development, and the life conditions connect to the larger society, the life conditions theory of the source of the orders, that those connect, of course, to cultural situations. Our civilization's getting more complex, and so to that extent, there is a nature and nurture recognition. But the stages are said to be purely psychological, and I think there are at least understandable reasons why conventional developmental psychology does not bring in any theoretical recognition of stages of cultural development. And I'll get to that in a minute. I was at an integral conference, some years ago, and Bill Torbert gave a presentation. He's a prominent developmental psychologist who's had a lot of influence. And I asked him directly, I said, well, the source of these stages, you're not really recognizing any stages of cultural development. How do those fit in? And he basically said they don't. We're not looking at culture, we're looking at psychology, and our analysis is of psychological development. Of course, this creates problems in all kinds of ways, which I'll keep coming back to, right? But just to sort of put my cards on the table, my point here is that the stages are real, but they originate in the evolution. They're primarily stages of history that are alive today that are influencing people's consciousness, right? So these are not just reactions to life conditions. What makes them, not universal, but large scale, what makes these orders of consciousness something that can be discovered and detected and measured by all the various assessment instruments that developmental psychologists have come up with, is that they're intersubjective stages of culture. But the idea that there are systems that are in a kind of a we space, that these systems are not just in the head, that there's some kind of field of collective consciousness that's interpenetrating people's minds, that's a theoretical understanding that developmental psychology does not recognize. And it's been criticized within academic psychology for that what it results in is if you're studying stages and what you're studying or what you're finding is that these stages of history, these stages of collective cultural consciousness are interpenetrating people's minds and acting as scaffolding for their personal development. what you're going to be measuring are the extent to which people are acculturated into different historical stages of development. And that means that you end up conflating the evolution of consciousness with the evolution of culture, right? I maintain there's much more to the individual psychological development of a human being and their consciousness than the stage of history that they use to make meaning. And you don't have to be an integralist or an integral philosopher to see this. Jerome Butler is he's certainly a prestigious and leading academic psychologist, and he's had some influential critiques of developmental psychology. His quote here is, "Psychological development is not a single staircase inside the head. It's a culturally mediated process of learning to participate in shared systems of meaning." And so in order to have shared systems of meaning, in order to give those some life and some corpus, and in order to understand what these shared systems of meaning are, then it really helps if you have a theory which allows for, the philosophical term is ontological intersubjectivity, right? In other words, intersubjectivity is a dimension of evolution that's just beginning to be recognized. Indeed, ontological intersubjectivity, as I'll argue in the final section, is a philosophical breakthrough of significant proportions, but it hasn't been influential enough, right? So that there is movement in professional philosophy to begin to recognize this area, as I've talked about in other places. Since 2018, there is a growing, substantial academic article on what the philosophers call social ontology. That's on the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. You can go and look at that. But it is organized by and pretty much informed by the whole discourse of social ontology, is taking place within analytical philosophy, which is very anti-metaphysical in many important ways. And so the idea that there are real systems in a real domain of development, and those are forms of collective consciousness that are interpenetrating people's minds, that's lost on most of the social ontology philosophers, even though they recognize that joint commitments have some influence, that they're not just, it's not just a contrived analytical category, but a real thing. But because they got the handcuffs of analytic philosophy, you can't really see that. Which leads to my critique, which is that the relative development of a person's individual consciousness cannot be smoothly equated with a worldview structure that provides their cultural center of gravity, right? So you can, I'm going back and forth, right? It's hard to say anything definitive without immediately being kind of questioned or contradicted by, culture is evolving, but of course, the only way culture evolves is if consciousness is evolving along with it. These intersubjective structures I'm talking about, those are made up of shared commitments and agreements and values and beliefs. And without consciousness, they wouldn't have any existence at all. So they depend on the evolution of consciousness, but the evolution of consciousness also depends on them. But because these are cultural structures, primarily, that's where their source is coming from, as I'm arguing and as I'll explain further as we go. These cultural structures, a person can make meaning, and when they do, it does evolve their consciousness. But that doesn't mean that their psychological development in terms of their character, their maturity, their virtue, their wisdom, all kinds of very important, I would say, central markers of one's psychological development aren't necessarily elevated when a person begins to make meaning at a higher stage of culture, right? And that means that when developmental psychologists test for people, I don't want to say anything too critical or too definitive, but if those tests, what they're testing for, what they're finding, what they're measuring is the acculturation of a person into a stage of history or a system of meaning making, that is important, but we can't reduce the person's overall psychological development or talk about simple orders of consciousness upon which people can be ranked as higher or lower, right? So giving some cultural weight and indeed partial independence to the structures of history that are in noosphere evolution, that we all were born into societies, and for the first time in history, we're living in societies that have, about 4 or 5 different worldviews that are kind of online at the same time, with people making meaning for most of history. Most national polities and other societies were governed by 1 or 2 worldviews, with one being clearly dominant. But now our problematic life conditions are that we have these structures of history are in a significant conflict, and that, of course, threatens the civilization itself, our nation and our culture. But that is a powerfully problematic life condition that not by itself, but it can contribute to the collective searching and finding of a higher level of historical development, a more developed form of culture, and the justification for talking about higher and lower, despite the violation of the social norm of cultural relativism, which is an important social norm, which I'll honor in a moment. The problem is that developmental psychologists are recognizing higher and lower stages, and the normative implications, the moral implications of higher and lower are something that the more astute developmental psychologists don't deny. They admit it. Kegan admits it. Graves admits it, as I'll say in a minute. But the idea that there are higher and lower levels of culture, man, that is really anathema to the sensibilities of the current elite, progressive, postmodern academic community in many different departments. And so again, I'll address that. It's not all wrong. There are 2 evident problems. There's more than 2, but at least 2 evident problems that are that become evident when we begin to question the theory that there is a ladder of psychological development wherein people can be assessed at being higher or lower on this vertical stage of development. The first one is that, as I've kind of already argued, that the ability to make meaning at a higher stage of culture, being able to metabolize a more complex and developed meaning-making system, does not always translate into a more developed or mature form of individual consciousness, right? We many of us know, modernists and progressive postmodernists who, indeed, their system of meaning making is more sophisticated than somebody who may be, a traditionalist. But that doesn't mean that they're better people or even more evolved psychologically overall. Their meaning making system may be, higher or lower, but there's much more to their psychological development. And some folks who use higher levels of meaning making are actually quite immature in their personal development, which is pretty evident from their works and their fruits and their speech. The second problem is this idea that stages cannot be skipped. This is a very strong dogma in developmental psychology. Kegan has said it, Wilber has carried it forward, and the idea is that if you're going to be able to make meaning at the stage of for example, self-authoring mind, which I think is Kegan's third stage, or autonomous mind. I can't remember all of his labels, but if you're going to be making meaning, you have to have, in a sense, passed through these higher stages. That because the stages develop based on both the accomplishments and the shortcomings of the previous stages, then we have to recognize that people are traveling in their development up the stages, and that they can't just jump ahead without being able to make meaning at the earlier levels. The trouble with this is that if we look at the cultural expression of modernism or progressive postmodernism, with these stages of history happen to correspond almost exactly to the description of the stages that are advanced by developmental psychology, right? Even though they're not identical, you can clearly see traditional and modern, because traditional and modern is really easy to test for, right? You can really tell but through almost any instrument. You don't even need to use a psychological assessment instrument. You can just ask people who are their heroes, right? Where they're getting their goodness, truth, and beauty will tell you which system of values they are forming their identity around. But we also can see that to the extent that modernism and progressive postmodernism, both seem to correspond as cultural structures in very similar ways to the psychological stages, we can see many people who were, to use the jargon, green at 16, right? That many of the people who were clearly making meaning using this progressive postmodern system of values and identity are manifesting all of the important accomplishments of that, the caring values, the sensitivity, right? All of the things which I'm going to talk about in a second that are superpowers of this progressive postmodern stage, in the same way that modernity, or these orange meme or fourth order consciousness, these also have superpowers which definitely make people more developed. But again, we all know people who are young, who make meaning effectively and can be clearly tested as identifying with this progressive postmodern stage, as I'm calling it. But they have no personal experience of traditional consciousness or modernist consciousness. They haven't passed through these earlier stages in their development, but they are using the higher stages nonetheless, because, as I maintain, once these worldviews appear along the historical timeline and they're kind of visible within a culture, they become available for people to use, right? Not necessarily embrace fully, right? People can have a rather tentative grasp on what these stages mean. But again, if you test them, they're going to demonstrate the superpower. So you can be making meaning without having gone through these earlier stages. Now, this is not true of culture. Culture doesn't, the stages of history can't be skipped, because indeed they do rely on each other in their progression. In other words, as I've said in other places, the traditional, the great religious civilizations, right, the pre-modern scripture-based civilizations of history, that these create very important superpowers, and they have accomplishments without which the emergence of modernity is impossible, right? They create law and order. They create civilized people who are willing to play fair. Not everybody, of course, but the vast majority. And that civilizing influence is prerequisite to the emergence of modernity, right? So in the development of a society, or in the development of human history, like all forms of evolution, that there's something more keeps coming from something less by taking up and using the accomplishments of the previous level, right? The success of the previous level creates a platform for its own transcendence, wherein the higher stage can emerge. But this emergence is deeply dialectical. There's a pushing off against, and the dialectical relationship between these different major stages of history, they evince being real evolution, because they have this structural sequence of emergence that dialectically unfolds. And the same can be said about progressive postmodernism, or the green meme as a stage of developmental psychology. And that is, authentic progressive postmodernism can only emerge in places that are both relatively wealthy and free, because you can't really begin to see the benefit or the application or the need for progressive postmodern values until you find yourself beginning to recognize the pathologies of modernity. The lack of deeper meaning, environmental degradation, gross inequality. There are many problems of modernity that only arise as a result of modernity's success. So until modernity succeeds to the point where its pathologies become evident, it doesn't provide a platform that can be transcended with a dialectical step beyond it. And so that's why this pattern of dialectical development can very much be understood in history, and we can talk about it in historical terms. But the idea that it's just changing life conditions, that's falsified by the fact that it's not just a seamless continuum of more complex life conditions. There are these steps. There are, revolutions. Modernity emerges in the Enlightenment, and the outworking of it in the French Revolution, the American Revolution is kind of an upheaval and a rejection of much of traditional religious authority and culture. And the same can be said with the emergence of progressive postmodernism. It too is in a pushing off against, right? Turn on, tune in, drop out, right? Is kind of how it becomes democratized in the 60s by rejecting modernity, right? So the structure of the stages is perfectly evident in the story of history. And when we get to individual psychology, I think bringing in the ability to recognize how these stages of history interpenetrate people's minds gives us a much clearer understanding of what these stages are and how we can be justifying them as stages. Okay, briefly, the normative implications of psychological growth, right? So I'm going to come back to cultural evolution in a second. But I want to read this quote from Kegan, because he's being brave here. Even though he's not recognizing cultural evolution, he is recognizing individual personal evolution. And he says, because developmental psychology tells a story of increase or greater complexity, it is thus more provocative, discomforting, even dangerous, and appropriately evokes greater suspicion. Anytime a theory is normative, and suggests that something is more grown, more mature, more developed than something else, we'd better check to see if the distinction rests on arbitrary grounds that consciously or unconsciously unfairly advantage some people, such as those who create the theory and people like them, and whose own preferences are being depicted as superior, right? So this is the standard progressive postmodern critique of any stage theory, is that, it's the people who are doing this assessment who are happen to be, come out on top. That's highly suspicious, right? And the idea that that Western values are being in a sense projected onto earlier or different stages of culture, that's a form of imperialism and indeed colonialism, and it's something that we need to reject. And this questioning of any assessment of higher or lower development is in a sense a reflection of cultural relativism, which has made important strides. So I'm going to get to that in a second, but I also want to emphasize Graves, who says essentially the same thing. Higher levels are better than lower levels, and the prime good of any society's governing figure should be to promote human movement up the levels of human existence, right? So Graves comes right out and admits that the stages that he's talking about, point to a normative development, and I think that's appropriate because we're trying to make the world a better place, and the evolution of consciousness is an important part of that, right? Every problem, at least partially, is a problem of consciousness. So the idea that we want to evolve consciousness and that evolution, it makes things better, not just personally but globally. That's a basic proposition, right? Although it has had earlier expressions that, need to be challenged and clarified, right? So there are many practitioners of spiral dynamics specifically who I have heard attempt to relativize or kind of avoid the implications of this stark statement by Graves by saying that, these different stages of development, they may have its complexity, but they're not better, right? That as a higher stage isn't better, it's just better for the specific life conditions. And that if we were to somehow end up with more primitive life conditions, then we would be better off with a more appropriate worldview or stage of development would be one of these earlier stages because they're best adapted to those life conditions. That's not all wrong, but I would say that that it's not a given. That what it is, it's a form of apologetics to try to bring the normative implications into alignment with the powerful social norm of cultural relativism. So we have in the 19th century the Industrial Revolution and the incredible economic and military empowerment of Europe and America. All of the countries which have gone through the Enlightenment and adopted a modernist form of consciousness and culture experience a gigantic material empowerment. And the result of that was an immature, Eurocentric, imperialistic hubris that Europeans were superior, right? It led to kind of ideas that our culture is superior because we're superior racially, which is, a moral nightmare of racism, which justified colonialism. And there was all kinds of huge moral hazards that accompanied the idea that some societies are more developed than others. And so understandably, the immaturity and immorality of that way of thinking was countered by early proponents of progressive postmodernism, such as Franz Boas and Margaret Mead, anthropologists, who argued for the social norm of cultural relativism. And it's not all wrong. In other words, what the beautiful thing about cultural relativism is it goes back and it reaffirms that humans everywhere, in all different cultural and social settings, we're far more alike than we are different. And that, that any attempt to talk about, especially, from the group that claims to be higher, that we need to level that we need to cut that off because of the horrors of colonialism and imperialism and all of the immature expressions of it in the 19th century and in early sociology and anthropology. But part of the trouble with cultural relativism is that it contains its own glaring performative contradiction, which is true for almost most progressive postmodern statements, and that is it's saying that that a relativistic view that sees each line of culture developing in its own way, that no comparisons can be made or rankings can be made, that's a claim of superiority, right? That they're pulling the rug out from under themselves philosophically by saying that cultural relativism is superior to recognizing cultural development, and that this this performative contradiction of cultural relativism it has moral hazards of its own, and those moral hazards can be seen in the idea that we have transcended societies that were based on slavery, or societies that practice human sacrifice, right? Although slavery still exists, and I'm not sure about sacrifice, but in most of the world, there's a general consensus that slavery is bad, and that sacrifice is bad, and that there's just sort of moral clarity around earlier human practices that were once thought to be natural and evident, which we now condemn. But if we say that a culture that practices slavery is morally equal, and that a culture that has grown out of slavery or gone through revolutions or important forms of its own sacrifice to eliminate slavery, if we say that doesn't make things better, then not only does it make it difficult to help spread or eradicate slavery wherever it exists in societies where it's still practiced, but it also makes it extremely difficult to defend the achievements of the society in which we live. And those achievements go beyond the obvious horrors of slavery or human sacrifice. We could talk about the equality of women, right? Which is, I think, a clear objective marker of the evolution of culture. That cultures wherein women are the equals of men are more developed morally than those wherein, now we could say the same thing about societies where there's peace, societies where there's prosperity, societies where there's rule of law, societies where there's human rights, right? I think we have a kind of a moral duty to say, like, human rights aren't just for us, kind of weird Westerners, that everybody in the world deserves human rights. And that I think we have, a moral duty to stand up for it. But if we are staunch cultural relativists, then our ability to make such claims is, cut off at the knees. So I want to make three arguments. There's more arguments than this. But if I'm saying that there are stages of history and that they do evince a normative progression, although not in every way, I say there's a polarity here. The part of the truth is a cultural relativism that everybody deserves respect, everybody's human, we're more alike than we are different, that there are big problems in claiming that you're superior. It leads to all kinds of problems. So we want to hold that in mind and say, yeah, that's true, but partial. In the same way that an aspiration for universal human rights and rule of law in the world, that's also something that is limited. You can go too far, right? Prosperity can become consumerism. Liberty can become anarchy, right? But nevertheless, if we keep these things in mind, if we have the egalitarian influence of cultural relativism and we put that in a polar relationship with this recognition that we want to make things better, and that means we have an obligation to affirm what's better and stand up for what's better, then those two things can inform each other and moderate each other. So on the side of the normative evolution of stages of history that interpenetrate people's minds, the first argument is that the stages are growing, these stages of consciousness and culture, they're growing in inclusivity, right? So almost all the developmental psychology stages recognize a kind of an ego-centric, ethnocentric, more nation-centric, and then a world-centric estimate of those worthy of moral consideration, right? So at the warrior stage, or spiral dynamics, the red value meme, the primary moral scope is egocentric, right? I'm looking out for number one, maybe my homies, but overall, it's very, egocentric, not just in its estimates of morality, but in all kinds of antisocial behaviors that come from this warrior kinds of culture. Then we move from, the sort of, the tribal or the individual to the ethnocentric or religiocentric, where people are in the same faith as us are worthy of moral consideration. And though, ethnocentrism is something we condemn now, we try to evolve beyond, there was a time in history where this was a massive moral breakthrough because it allowed humanity to organize themselves in larger societies where wisdom could be shared and there could be law because everybody was unified by a singular religion, for the most part. And then, of course, we move with modernity to a kind of a social structure where more than one religion can be accommodated, right? The circle of inclusivity grows wider to include everybody who lives in the same nation, right? All of your compatriots, but also to some extent, all humans, right? But that sense of inclusivity then goes further with the rise of progressive postmodernism, or this green value stage, using spiral dynamics to talk about it. That at least in its more pure expressions, widens the circle of inclusivity to include all sentient beings, right? Not just all humans, but animals and the environment. It's definitely more inclusive, at least before it becomes hijacked by identity politics. But that's another story. I might get to that later. But I think that again, this is highly simplified, right? This is just a talk. I'm not delivering a detailed academic seminar about this, and I want it to be accessible to folks, so I'm simplifying. But at least one way that I think we can make a philosophical claim of normative development is this rising inclusivity as the stages develop in history. Another important argument for why stages of cultural evolution can be recognized even while acknowledging the important caveats and critiques of cultural relativism is the idea that each one of these major worldviews, as they emerge in history and as they interpenetrate people's minds, as they become available for people to use, they have massive superpowers. They're like a kind of mental operating system that gives people new abilities that they didn't have before adopting this system. And there's powerful evidence for that in the fruits of the cultures that each stage delivers, right? So the emergent superpowers, again, to oversimplify and abbreviate, the emergent superpowers of traditional consciousness as it emerges, it brings moral strength, moral clarity, right? That is, this egocentric warrior consciousness is doesn't, what's right is what's most powerful. It's dog eat dog. But the religious superpower brings a sense of the golden rule. And that creates social trust that can create powerful forms of culture, right? Then with the emergence of modernity, there's a new birth of reason, a new empirical understanding, a scientific clarity that could see the natural world at a new level. And modernity also brings an initiative, right? A restlessness that breaks out of the conformist consciousness of pre-modern forms of culture. And these superpowers translate to people. Modernist consciousness is more powerful. Not just for bad, but for good. And modernist consciousness makes you smarter, right? So the observation that kids from wealthy homes consistently do better on the SAT, it's not because, in most cases that they had more tutoring. It's because they live in a modernist household where the values of modernity have given them mental abilities which show up on these IQ tests. The same with progressive postmodernism. It brings the superpowers of emotional empathy, sensitivity. It gives access to the feelings of others and the interiority of others that people don't have at the same level within modernity. There may be empathy at every level, but progressive postmodernism brings a new superpower of that. And then the final argument that I'll at least make here is that consistently, if you look at history over the last several hundred years, people want what higher stages deliver, right? People have a right to be who they are. That was one of Claire Graves' famous sayings, and I endorse that. I think, again, the cultural relativism means everybody deserves respect. But if you look at the youth of the pre-modern countries that are pre-democratic, and what they want is they want liberty and prosperity. At least most of them, right? While the adults may be loyal to their worldview and don't aspire to modernity, it's clearly attractive to the youth, and it's been attracting the majority of humanity, at least in major parts of the world over the last 300 years, right? The movement is gradually into modernity, and the regression to traditional consciousness, at least at a cultural level, is not as evident as the increasing growth of modernity. And the same can be said for progressive postmodernity. The youth of places like America are drawn to what they perceive as the moral superiority of progressive postmodern consciousness, right? Not only just our young people are attracted to it, but the good people, the elites, the highly educated people have adopted progressive postmodern cultural consciousness en masse. And so this is not just my value judgment. This is the value judgment of humanity, at least major portions of humanity over hundreds of years. Now there's, again, we could say, well, there's exceptions to that and there's caveats. But in general, I think that we can point to this kind of collective desire for these higher levels. Okay, final section, and then we'll get to some questions and answers. And this has to do beyond conventional developmental psychology, which Graves is a special case. Graves recognized that these stages were what he called biopsychosocial, that the stages were, in your wiring, that he claimed that you could find to what stage by the galvanic electrical skin response, although that didn't pan out. That was part of spiral dynamics originally. And of course, the psycho and the social means that they're stages of consciousness and culture, that they're expressed in culture, they're in society, but they're also in people's heads. But again, Graves did not have a robust theory of ontological intersubjectivity, so he still relied on life conditions, like the other developmental psychologists, to explain what's causing this stage-wise progression. And so the first people to recognize these stages, whether they be consciousness or culture or some, vague combination of the two. I mentioned Peter M. Sorokin, his work. He's an early father of sociology, taught at Harvard. His work in the 20s and the 30s. He called himself an integral philosopher, and he recognized stages, although not what we would say as the stages that are kind of accepted in this discourse. And then we have Gebser. He recognized stages, and he called them mutations in consciousness. and he didn't want to align it with evolution, so his theory was important, and it has informed interval philosophy. I want to honor Gebser, but he did his work in the 30s and the 40s and into the 50s to a degree, but he didn't have the benefit of this larger cultural space where we can recognize others who've recognized these things, and we can critique it and develop it and improve it. Perhaps the most significant integration of developmental psychology into philosophy was brought about by the work of Jürgen Habermas, who in the 70s, he had a very influential German philosopher, part of the Frankfurt School, Jürgen Habermas. His theory of communicative action, he brought in Lawrence Kohlberg's stages of moral development to argue for people at the stage of modernity. I mean, you can call it that, but this kind of rational stage allows for rational actors that create forms of communication that justify law and moral decisions. And so Habermas, very influential mainstream philosopher, and he had a significant influence on Ken Wilber, who adopted this stage-wise development and then advanced his theory further once he came in contact with Graves and his understanding of progressive postmodernism. Now, most of you are familiar with Wilber's four-quadrant model of evolution. There's no way that I can teach it or explain it here, but I bring it up just to show that in Wilber's model, the intersubjective domain of collective consciousness, right, the we space, and the subjective space of individual psychology, that these are co-evolving together, that the same stages that define the evolution of history and culture are the same stages that define the evolution of individual people. And I will, in my next talk, in a few months, I'll present my critique, my constructive, appreciative critique of Wilber's quadrant model. But I'm bringing it up here just to point to the fact that while he recognizes that consciousness and culture co-evolve and gives ontological weight, this lower left quadrant is part of this breakthrough of ontological intersubjectivity. But Wilber then promulgates a theory of altitudes. And his theory of altitudes, he's, here in this famous chart, he's got different lines: cognitive line, moral line, values line, ego development line, faith line. And according to Wilber's theorizing, all of these lines grow according to these same universal altitudes, which he labels with the spiral dynamics colors, but which are, again, theorized to be potentials that are in the human body. That these are the natural potentials that every human's born with, and that they're unfolding more or less, and that in some ways that these altitudes are pre-given, that both consciousness and culture are ordered in their stage-wise development by these pre-existing altitudes. But I think that in a sense has a tendency to conflate the evolution of consciousness with culture. What I mean by that is that, for example, if you look at the life conditions that brought about the Enlightenment, the life conditions that created modernity, right? There were certainly many unique features of Europe that we could point to that were the unique life conditions that brought about modernity. But those same life conditions existed in early Islam and in China and in the antiquity and many other places. And yet they didn't result in the full-blown development of modernity as a world-changing historical level. And so the idea of this kind of shows that just the life conditions by themselves don't explain it. Neither is it properly theorized as just a sort of the series of altitudes that are just pre-existing levels, because it discounts the accomplishments of history, right? Modernity is not just some pre-given level. It's actually a gigantic emergence in history that's highly unpredictable, that's highly unusual, that has its own unique and highly contingent context. It's not automatic or pre-given. It doesn't occur everywhere. It's, in some ways it's a miracle. Like all major forms of emergence, it can't be thoroughly explained. It kind of breaks out of what came before and brings novelty into the universe. So if we know, for example, if we begin to recognize that the source of the stages are in the historical accomplishments of noosphere evolution, We can begin to see that these accomplishments, the accomplishments of future civilizations, are not available to us today. That the integral stage, we know what it is, we can say what it can do, we can describe it, we can point to it in people's minds. But in order, according to this dialectical understanding of historical development, in order for a stage to emerge, the previous stage has to be successful enough not only to create a platform for its own transcendence, but to create the pathologies that begin to emerge as it oversolves and begins to go past its early phase. And it's those pathologies that create the pressures. So if there haven't been the accomplishments and there haven't been the pathological pressures, then there hasn't been the requisite conditions for the next step to emerge. So we can certainly see the pattern and anticipate what the post-integral stage of development will look like. That it'll be a dialectical antithesis. It'll push off against. The pattern is predictive. But the idea that these stages already exist, that this turquoise stage is some stage of culture that has already transcended this integral stage, or this postmodern stage, as I call it, I think is challenged by this recognition of historical development and the actual contingent accomplishments that are being made by collective humanity as they struggle in history to make the world a better place. So this is a highly simplified diagram, just to kind of conclude this. This is not a model of consciousness, or it's not a model of psychological development. It just shows a way of thinking about the influence of these intersubjective structures, these stages of cultural and historical evolution, that they form fields of consciousness that when people live in a society, or depending on who they, what media they consume or what friends they have, that they can acculturate into these forms of scaffolding, these cultural forms of consciousness that are grounded in large-scale intersubjective worldviews, and those interpenetrate people's minds in the same way, or maybe not entirely in the same way, but in a way that could be compared, at least in this highly simplified chart, with biological consciousness, right? So part of our consciousness is from our bodies, right? If you don't eat, you're going to be grumpy, right? There's so much of human psychology that can be at least partially explained by evolutionary psychology, but it can't explain everything. I mean, we're not controlled by cultural consciousness. We're not controlled by some people, they're like almost like puppets of these stages of consciousness. The stages seem to think their thoughts for them. Other people are totally controlled by their biology, right? So there are some folks whose individual human freedom, as I'm showing here in the middle, don't objectify these things. They're not able to control their urges or resist the larger cultural structures. But I think a healthy human has all kinds of things that are not in this chart in their psychology. But recognizing the influence of biology from below and culture from above, it begins to explain how intersubjective consciousness, intersubjective cultural consciousness, can influence people's minds. So just in my conclusion here, developmental psychology is not all wrong, but it can improve by recognizing the influence of cultural stages and broadening its scope to recognize that a lot of the stages that it's recognizes are stages of culture. As Graves famously put, these are types of consciousness within people more than they are types of people. And, there's a lot more arguments, but that at least gives you some idea of where I'm coming from in my critique. And I can just finish by saying it's very important to recognize the breakthrough of ontological intersubjectivity and the reality of these cultural forms of consciousness, because by seeing them better, the rest of the mainstream society can't even see progressive postmodernism as a worldview structure. They can certainly see the far left, they can see wokeism, they can see progressivism as a political movement, but they don't have a concept of a worldview system that's metabolizing value energy. And this kind of philosophical breakthrough, which can see these structures more clear than ever before, is entirely needed and useful because it can help us solve the most pressing life condition that we face at this time in history, as I said at the beginning, which is this culture war But seeing green for its good and bad, seeing it as an important system of values, as well as modernity and how they're related to each other, how they build on each other, this is a form of understanding that is not well recognized or influential. And I hope that in the time ahead, it can become more recognized because it offers amazing solutions to some of the thorniest problems that don't seem to have any proponents suggesting anything other than civil discourse or some other process-oriented solution. So again, there's a lot of this. I could go on, and I'm sorry to have gone on as long as I have. We could talk about it some more, maybe next time we meet. It depends on how much conversation there is around this. But there's a lot to deliver. I mean, especially when you're making a critique, you got to be very careful. And there's lots of careful things that I haven't mentioned. So let me just throw it open here to questions and comments and challenges, or anything that might that you might want to bring up.
Great, thanks, Steve. Go ahead and use the react button, the little heart shape. Raise your hand, and I'll call on you. Let's start with John and then David.
Thanks very much, Steve. My question is actually, you only very briefly touched on it in your last seconds of your talk. In popular conversation, we speak of the left-right spectrum, which at first glance seems very horizontal. At the same time, it does seem to refer to progressivism on one end and conservatism on the other. And those who use it seem to think that the middle is just a fusion or a mix of it. You might say that modernism should be in the middle, but I'm not sure the middle does refer to modernism. But another hypothesis of mine is maybe modernists created it, and what they're really measuring is how far they are away from the modern perspective. In any event, the question would be, how do you reconcile this left-right spectrum with a vertical developmental perspective?
Sure, excellent question. This is something that is addressed in my book, Developmental Politics, and on the various websites, Developmental Politics website and the Cultural Evolution website. I have many different takes on how to explain this. This left-right spectrum is not all wrong. Again, it's just too simplistic to be able to describe where we are now. Historically speaking, it comes from the French Revolution, those who sat on the left, those who sat on the right. But, in 20th century, 21st century discourse, it carries on, and it does have some descriptive value. But again, with, if modernity, if centrist modernists are in the middle, I have an article called Why Centrism Fails, because the center can no longer hold culturally, right? Because the idea that there's just a left and the right and that we're going to meet in the middle is, in a sense, complicated and partially falsified by this recognition that progressive postmodernism is rejecting both modernity and traditionalism, and it would be, in some ways, a moral failing for them to compromise. Right? The politics is a morality play, and if politics becomes your religion, then again it becomes immoral. Now this is a important question, and there's a lot to it. But because I've covered it so much, in both what I've written, we have diagrams and videos. I would refer you to that, and I could go on talking about that for half an hour, but. You're right.
Centrism article would be a good place.
Yeah. Why centrism fails.
It's I just dropped that in the chat. Great. All right. We'll do David and then Jackson. And just a reminder, try to keep it concise so we can get to as many people as possible. All right, David, go for it.
Great. So, Steve, this was an awesome presentation. I love the complexity of your message. Can't wait to hear parts 2 and 3 that you've promised to bring us here sometime soon. I particularly enjoyed the separation of cultural development taking the place over centuries, eons, and individual development confined to our short lifetimes, and then exploring the interplay of an individual born in different times, but also in different cultures. So a question might came to mind, if you had 3 neighbors that all had a kid on the same day, and one was a very religious family, pick your book, one was a very modernist, and one was a very postmodern progressive. As those children became teenagers and even perhaps young adults, I'm curious to hear your thoughts on how their developmental progression as individual altitude progression would be similar or different when you look at what the belief systems that they grew up in, similarities and differences. 3 minutes.
Sure. Well, I mean, there's a natural tendency for teenagers to reject their parents, regardless of their cultural situation. It's almost reflexive, right? You want to become your own person, so you have to push off against, the parental family authority. I mean, and in some ways, that's how the individual development recapitulates the larger development of history, right? We can see that, the thesis and antithesis action of dialectical development at both a historical level and at a personal development level, both in terms of the psychology and in the basic circumstances of teenagers growing up in these various households, right? So it used to be that teenagers would grow up in, conservative households, the main pattern. They'd go to college. They'd become, they'd encounter existential problems with the traditional worldview, namely science, falsifying many of the stories of the Bible. And that existential crisis would cause many of them to either adopt modernity while harmonizing it with their religious cultural upbringing, or rejecting it, rather violently. My father was raised a Catholic and he became a staunch atheist because he was kind of very, very fed up. He couldn't buy into the stories or the level of Catholicism that he'd grown up in. Same with modernist kids, right? That is, at least, in the 60s, many of the hippies were not, growing up in fundamentalist religious households. They were growing up, they were the upper middle class. They were growing up in modernist households, and they embraced progressive postmodernism as a natural way of not being satisfied. They could see, that modernity, that they looked at they had almost everything modernity could offer, and they said, is this all there is? I don't want to just be a junior executive or climb on the ladder of prestige or just accumulate status and material. I want more meaning in my life, and I'm not going to go back to, the religious level. So definitely, but now we're seeing a generation of kids that many of them have grown up within progressive postmodern households. And either some of them are converting, to religious. They're going to an earlier form of culture. Some of them are rejecting progressive postmodern and becoming modernists. And a few are actually beginning to recognize postmodernism as something that is indeed more inclusive and more complex and developed. It has superpowers that these earlier forms of cultural consciousness don't have. And there's a few that are beginning to recognize that, but we're still in early days of that.
Awesome. Thank you. I appreciate the response.
Great. All right, Jackson, Elaine, and then Mary.
Yeah, great talk, Steve. I look forward to watching it when it comes out on YouTube. Hopefully it does. And my question was about personal stages, because I tend to think the individual drives the social, cultural stages. But would you say that every human has the potential to go through all of these stages? Or, like I tend to believe, it's more of a generational evolutionary process to get through and civilization at one of these higher stages?
Excellent question. I think that I mentioned earlier that the accomplishments and the systems of the higher level operating systems that we can anticipate will continue to unfold as human history continues to develop, hopefully. That those are not available entirely to us today. An analogy might be St. Francis of Assisi, right, who was definitely pre-modern traditionalist, very pious saint. And he, in some ways, we could point to the proto-progressive postmodernism in St. Francis, right? His environmental sensitivity, his spiritual fragrance. I mean, there are many things about St. Francis's life story that do resonate with a progressive postmodern value system, but it's highly inchoate. It's highly, because he's pre-modern. There hasn't been in history, this modernist stage hasn't come online in any significant way during his time. That he's only showing, it's more like a higher harmonic as opposed to a full note. So until the stages appear in history, they're not available for anybody to use. And once they do, folks can use them. I would say there are plenty of people who are making meaning using a progressive postmodern worldview. And if they take a psychological development assessment test, they're probably going to be assessed at being at that level of development. but is it available to anybody? It's available to anybody in which that it's been achieved culturally. So, progressive postmodernism is in the culture, right? You can't miss it. And those who are naturally attracted to it, it's available to them, right? There are other forms of developmental psychology, kind of niche, like Michael Common's, that some folks are fond of. I've never been that impressed, but he's tried to take Piaget and make it mathematical, right? Make it empirical and scientific, and I commend those efforts. But when I look at it, it seems like he's talking about levels of intelligence. Like the people who had higher levels of common system are just plain, the higher levels, you've got to have genius level IQ to be able to make meaning there. It's more an individual development, but that is conflated with IQ. And how can you develop your IQ? There's quite a lot of social science that says maybe a little bit, but not much, right? But then we have to go back to, IQ, is that a valid line? Is it a valid measurement? I mean, it's a can of worms. So I would say that any normal person who has normal cognitive faculties can move up through the stages, and maybe some people who might be handicapped mentally can't. But I'm certainly not expert about such a subject.
Great. All right. Just a few more minutes. Elaine, Mary, and then Michael, if we have time.
Wonderful presentation. Thank you, Steve. You mentioned different worldviews. The one you haven't mentioned is what is called now by some people the indigenous kinship worldview, which means being akin to everything that exists, which also may correspond to a highest level, one of the highest level of individual consciousness. So where does this fit in that picture?
Sure, excellent question. I said at the beginning, I'm kind of presuming upon some familiarity with the larger field of developmental psychology, and that includes this recognition of a tribal or indigenous stage. I mean, again, these are dicey terms because indigenous people live in the developed world. Almost there was a time in history where the most complex form of social organization across the world were tribes. And even though every tribe was different, they all had very similar social structures, and they each had a chief, they each had a shaman. They were almost always animistic in their spirituality. And there's very important wisdom at the tribal level of consciousness that has been lost. And when one of the ways that we develop is we reclaim and rediscover the wisdom of previously discarded stages, right? So this understanding that there's deep indigenous wisdom that we need today, and that there's been important things that are lost that need to be recovered, that project begins with progressive postmodernism.
Right.
But it is carried on in post-postmodernism because we want to go further. We don't want to just romanticize it or call it higher, because there's many ways that if we're honest about ourselves and we look at the social conditions, there are many noble and beautiful things, but men and women couldn't eat together, right? Women are not equal, in these societies. Again, there's exceptions to everything I'm saying. So when you speak in generalities, it's always hazardous. But let me just honor indigenous wisdom, that I would say it's part of the superpower of integral consciousness, because this postmodern consciousness, because it can recognize the superpowers of every stage and use them. And there's superpowers there that are an important part of both postmodern and post-postmodern consciousness.
Thank you, Steve.
All right, Mary.
Hey, so I'll be quick. So thank you, Steve. And I love your passion about evolution of culture. It's just really great to hear and see you. So my question is pretty specific and maybe a little small compared to your overall presentation. But when you mentioned how an example that a young person could be kind of like fully immersed in postmodern consciousness, but not have really spent much time at all in traditional or in modern. Like, I wonder what happens when that person is faced with a major stress or trauma or some setback that for all of us usually sends us back a little bit. So so then does somebody go back really to an earlier stage? I feel like if there isn't some kind of, even if it's a short-lived, some kind of grounding in each stage, when we have these things that make us slide down, where do we go to? So I don't know if you have.
You know, that's such an excellent question. Let me just say that that every one of these worldviews, at least, you know, from a theoretical overview, every one of them, the trigger point is that I mentioned the existential problem that was Einstein famously said can only be solved at a higher level of thinking, right? So each one of these stages has a kind of a point where it can't go any further and it needs to emerge into something higher. And that's what progressive postmodernism does, but it encounters its existential problem, and that it's got all these caring, sensitive values and can see all these very important things that the society needs to know and embrace, and yet it can't get the rest of the society to agree with it, and partially it's because it rejects the rest of the society. So this is an existential problem, right, for progressive postmodernism. It's relative political impotency, at least at a national scale, and that's one of the existential problems that Integral can solve, that the postmodern stage has powers that can address that progressive, because it's moving from antithesis to synthesis, and the synthesis can better include and harmonize and be sympathetic to modernity and traditionalism in ways that progressivism can't, because it's still in the historical process of pushing off against and rejecting. Right, so it can't be everything all at once. It's got to take these historical steps according to what's available for movement. But one of the things that we're seeing to a degree is in response to this relative political impotency within progressive postmodern culture, the culture as a whole has regressed. It's not just individuals. Now, again, I'm generalizing. This isn't the case for everybody. But when you move from a world-centric morality where everybody counts, which is one of the propositions that gave birth to progressive postmodernism, was this beautiful moral vision of everybody counting, and animals and the environment too. When that becomes corrupted by identity politics, where they move from a world-centric conception to what looks much more like an ethnocentric conception, where there's in-groups and out-groups, and you're inclusive as long as you believe our ideology, but if you don't, you're a fascist, I would say that's a collective regression, not just an individual one. And certainly the loudest voices in that ethnocentric trope of progressive postmodernism have definitely regressed. But again, they are making meaning using the values of progressive postmodernism. So, it's complex. We can't just say that they've gone back to being traditionalists or ethnocentric, bigots, even though they're exhibiting those behaviors. So regression definitely can occur. We could say this about modernity, right? When there are many modernists who are sophisticated, educated modernists, but they've become warrior egocentric in many ways. So again, that's why it's liberating to recognize these as stages of cultural consciousness and not individual people, types of consciousness in people, because one of the things that keeps integral philosophy from gaining larger recognition is that you don't need to know the details to know that that's just flat wrong, right? I mean, Stegan Academy, Rand Stegan's a close friend of mine. He's on the board of the Institute for Cultural Evolution. He's been applying integral philosophy in the realm of personal development of CEOs for 25 years. And he's had to it's like a lab. You can see what smart, common sense people balk at. And one of the things they balk at is that green is straightforwardly higher, that progressive postmodernism is simply more evolved, because, not only are they not progressive postmodernists, but also they can tell that there's ways in which just claiming that somebody who makes meaning at that level is generally more evolved overall, that their psychology is at a higher order, that's just wrong. They just know that. And so there's ways in which correcting this, improving it, making it more philosophically robust can help overcome these understandable rejections to the proposition that people can be, placed on a linear hierarchy of higher or lower in their psychology.
All right. Well, we're at time, everyone. I'm glad we have more hands raised, but we'll just have to get to it next time. We will get this recorded and up on YouTube, hopefully next week. Our next meetup will be the second Wednesday of November 12th. Not sure what we're going to do yet for that, but we'll let you know as soon as we do.
Jeff Carrera is going to be sharing his important work with us, and I'll introduce Jeff, and I'm really impressed with his prolific output. And he was formerly one of the major players in the Enlightened Next community. And so I think you'll appreciate Jeff Carrera next month.
All right. Well, thank you all. Steve, thank you so much. That was an excellent presentation. And we'll see you all next month.
Thanks, Rigel. Thanks, everyone. Great
Thank
to see you.
you.
All right.
Thanks, Steve. Bye, everybody.